Daddy, we're doing.
I'm doing a podcast, Dizzy. Hello and welcome to the Too Cool for School podcast. I am your host, Yannick, and on today's episode, we are discussing race in the workplace. And I've got an amazing guest with me today, organizational psychologist, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Yannick. My name is Keisha York. I'm an organisational psychologist as well as a visiting lecturer at King's College London. And I'm also the founder of the Black People in Psychiatry and Psychology Network. And I also do consultancy on the side. So thank you very much for having me here today on the podcast.
That's amazing. You're doing so many, different and amazing things. And before we dive into our questions, let's dive into some of the amazing things that you do. So tell us a bit more about your role as like a visiting lecturer to start off with. So what do you do at King's College as a visiting lecturer?
Yeah, so I support the Masters in Organisational Psychiatry and Psychology programme at King's College London. And what I do particularly is do lectures on diversity management in the workplace, organisational behaviour, and also around health psychology and issues related to racial equity in general. And that largely started whilst I was doing my PhD. At King's College London in the same topic, organisational psychology, and my research very much touched on a lot of the topics that were explored in that master's programme. So I was invited on to do lecturing there.
That's amazing. And BIP, tell us a bit more about BIP.
Yeah, so BIP was a passion project I started about 6 years ago. And that was when I was delving into the field of psychology or exploring it more widely, and very much quickly realised that myself, as well as a few or minority others, were the only Black faces in the room when it came to discussions around mental health in the Black community, and particularly in organisational psychology, how race and mental health intertwines within the workplace. So I started initially the BIP network with a small group of individuals, and we aimed to just do one event which explored some of these themes, and we ended up having over 300 people in the room, psychiatrists, psychologists, students who are also passionate about representation in psychology and mental health of the Black community. And from there, it was this budding group of aspiring psychologists who aimed to host events, projects, activities which supported the aspiring psychology community, aspiring psychology Black community, and psychiatrists as well.
That's amazing. And to be honest, that's how I first came across you. One of my colleagues who's an EP sort of signposted.
Yeah, he was a part of BIP Network as well.
Yeah, he was a part of the network. And there's a few, when I was looking through like your social media pages, website, etc., and looking at some of the things that you've done in the past, there was a few clinicians and people that I know within that area. So I think, it speaks a lot to, the work that you've done with the network. And for me personally, whenever anyone gets in touch and says, Jan, like, you need to have this person like on your podcast, like, they're just amazing, and they're bigging you up before I've even had a chance to network with you. I think it speaks depth to the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And like organizational, not necessarily organizational psychology, but your interest in that particular area, where has that come from? Because even like when when you and I have had discussions outside of this about like what this episode and what our discussion would look like there's something that just, piqued my interest about race in the workplace, and there's actually people who do work around that sort of area. So what was it that sort of drew you to that in the first instance?
Yeah, so like many students who go into psychology, initially I wanted to go into clinical psychology, but I very quickly realised that whilst I liked therapy and I like the techniques and the practices used in counselling to support individuals' mental health, I think there was a largely ignored topic, which is that most people spend nearly almost a majority of their week and their lives in the workplace. And the stress that accumulates in the workplace, or potentially not being in the workplace, intertwines into every aspect of your life and affects your mental health. And there is not a lot of organizational psychologists, particularly in this area, and considering how this also relates to Black people and the racism and discrimination we experience in the workplace, and how that affects our ability to navigate these environments, our commitment to the organization, our willingness to thrive and stay within these organizations, and overall feel mentally healthy. So that was one of the first reasons. And actually the second reason is a really personal reason. So my mother, actually, she was a head of year in high school. And she actually got restructured out of her role and effectively discriminated against. And she stopped working because of it. And I directly witnessed the severe impacts it had on her mental health. She ended up suing her employer and actually winning one of the largest racial discrimination cases in the UK. But it was me having to support her alongside that, and very quickly realising that there was not a lot of attention and support in the workplace for individuals who are experiencing discrimination or racism in the workplace. In general, just the policies and initiatives used to ensure that this doesn't occur within the workplace. It really ignited my drive, and I pursued organizational psychology as a way to develop research to support people in the workplace and overall look at how we can make a more healthier, inclusive and equitable work environment for individuals of different backgrounds.
Yeah, that's so powerful, and like hearing that is very inspiring, and I think to really touch upon the fact that for a lot of us, we do spend the majority of our time, in the workplace, and often we don't consider the impact that being in the workplace can have on our mental health, our well-being, how we engage with our family, how we engage with our peers, our friendship groups, and just how we are, as individuals. And, the fact that you can have, 10 people go into an office doing the same job, but having different experiences, is really, telling. And, how do we allow those people who are going into those workplaces, irrespective of their different backgrounds and upbringing and the different things that they're having to navigate, to have like a sort of balance or equitable experience across the board. So that's very just thinking about that is so interesting to me. And you touched briefly upon like workplace discrimination and racism. And I wanted to know, like, from your experience, like, what are some of like the subtle workplace racism or discrimination that sometimes people overlook or think, actually, this is not a big deal or don't take seriously?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we already know that racism in the workplace predominantly is addressed either at the individual level, so the microaggressions we might experience, the biases, the comments that we might hear from our colleagues that are prejudicial and stereotypical, or it could happen at the institutional level, whereby we're thinking about the policies, practices and processes that discriminate individuals from marginalised backgrounds. But one thing, particularly throughout my research and also within my experience, that I think isn't discussed a lot and typically touches on more the systemic level, is the lack of inclusion in informal social circles within the workplace, and how that actually affects particularly Black people's progression in the workplace. So there's this really interesting researcher called Cox who argues that for an organisation to be particularly inclusive and diverse, people need to be embedded not within the formal structures, so not just having a manager or a leader who is Black. You also need to see them in the informal structures. So these are your social events that happen outside of the workplace. So think of like your after work drinks or being invited to your manager's home for like a dinner party. These informal structures are typically where resources are shared. It's typically where you might access a mentor. It's typically where you might find out about a work opportunity that you wouldn't have realised in the actual official formal workplace. And because as a Black person, we enter these spaces already having to understand and learn how to navigate a particularly white, westernized work environment. We might not necessarily have the same level of contacts or networks within those formal institutions. We spend majority of our time thinking about how to present ourselves in the formal workplace, how to be really productive or demonstrate that we are keen and motivated to excel. Whereas within the informal setting, those opportunities to actually excel, those opportunities to actually thrive or actually learn how to navigate the office are spaces we don't necessarily are, or not don't necessarily, we aren't necessarily aware of, and might actually shy away from it because we recognize that we spend all day having to navigate office politics and present a version of ourselves that isn't maybe our authentic natural selves in the office. Why do I then want to do that in like a social after work drinks or in some sort of social event or hobby or interest group that they're doing? And these spaces are really important. So to kind of sum up, my core point is a big part of the way that one of the key areas which we ignore when it comes to discrimination in the workplace is exclusion from informal social networks within the organisation. That is actually key for having access to developmental opportunities, promotions in the workplace. And that in itself is inadvertent discrimination that we could be experiencing but not even aware of.
So is it discrimination then if... It's discrimination if you're not invited, but is it discrimination if you don't want to go?
It's not discrimination if you don't want to go. If you don't want to go to like a work party, then fine. But what is discrimination is that in these informal social environments, that is where opportunities might be circulated or resources might be circulated. And that means it's not equitable in the work environment because you do not have that same access to those opportunities that individuals who are of a certain group might get if they are attending those social attending those social work parties or those different types of events that are informal in the workplace.
Yeah, no, you make a good point, and the reason I asked that question is because, you know, when I've been invited to, you know, such settings, whether it's like after work drinks or whatever else, because it's not something that I'm always keen on doing. I'm like, man, I don't want to go for drinks, but then I'm not necessarily thinking about the access to opportunities, those little golden nuggets that you can get in those informal settings. And when I think about it, and I'm sure many people will listen to this and reflect and say, actually, I learn more outside of the workplace about how to sort of navigate through life and how to develop and how to get to the sort of next chapter in those informal settings than I do
in the actual
in the actual workplace. But what is it about those informal settings that means that, and it's not often the case, and I'm just talking about my own experience, but I'm sure many would share my experience. But what is it about those informal settings where we feel either, you know what, we're not comfortable, we don't want to be there, it's not for us, or whatever else? So I think it's something, you know, for people to
reflect on.
Yeah, for people to reflect on.
And I'd also add to that, because the reality is humans bond through time they spend in informal social settings, right? Places where you feel like you can be yourself, places where you can speak openly with those individuals. In the workplace, you cannot necessarily do that, right? There are certain professional norms that you have to abide by. Outside of the workplace is your opportunity to do that, and you can form closer bonds maybe with your colleagues. This is what the literature is hypothesizing, that these are your opportunity to form closer bonds with your colleagues outside of the work. And then naturally through those closer bonds, that is when you might be alerted to opportunities that haven't been advertised, right? perhaps office politics, for instance, that you weren't necessarily aware of beforehand, but you are aware of now, and learn how to navigate these sort of office politics, or even just mentors, perhaps, that wouldn't have offered you mentorship in the formal workplace, but would have because they feel like I can relate to you better because we are in these informal social settings. And I think you raise a really good point about why we don't feel comfortable being in these settings. And I would argue there's potentially many reasons, but largely because they tend to be settings where it's predominantly white individuals or individuals who might not share our same cultural norms and social values, largely aligned with very westernized Eurocentric ideas of like socialization. And I guess there's this argument that we, even in the workplace, when we are doing our best to perform or demonstrate our affinity to these cultural norms, we don't necessarily relax in these social settings. We are still performing again. And as a result, people just shy away and say, you know what, I'd rather go home. I'd rather sit at home and be with my friends, be with my family and get to relax and be myself than keep having to perform. And
put on a performance.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's very insightful. Thank you for sharing. And I wanted to know, so when we're in the workplace, how can people differentiate between, you know, like what is workplace stress and what is like trauma, maybe caused from like racial discrimination or whatever?
Yeah, so I think what's important to note is that workplace stress is a negative reaction that someone might have to excessive pressures in the workplace, particularly when these pressures are not met with significant support from your managers or your peers, or perhaps you're not clear in the role and the sort of work tasks that you're able to do, where you don't have a lot of control around your work tasks. There's extensive literature and organizational theorists that argue workplace stress is due to many different things, but largely workplace stress is just a negative reaction you might have to excessive workplace stress or excessive work demands. This completely differentiates from trauma. And there's a really good psychologist called Carter, American counseling psychologist, who argued that trauma, especially racial trauma or trauma related to racial discrimination or race-based stress, is equivalent to the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So you might demonstrate hypervigilance, you might demonstrate anxiety, depression, significant stress, and actually pathological physical symptoms, so hypertension, for instance. And it's those continued demonstration of those symptoms or those indicators which distinguish what you're experiencing, stress, from actual trauma. Yeah.
Wow. And those symptoms, like, does it have long-term impact? So if you experience like that trauma or that microaggression, like what's the long-term impact, especially if it's not addressed? And from your experience, I'm not sure whether you've been able to, you know, speak with people who have experienced you know, workplace racism and discrimination, but when they want that to be addressed, what does that look like? Because if we've got people who are, you know, line managers or, you know, managers in their respective roles, if they have someone who's experienced that, they might be thinking, okay, this is what, you know, my employee or my colleague has told me about their experience. Okay, this is how I should deal with it. But their way of dealing with it may be based on their, you know, own conscious bias or whatever else. But from your experience, how have people who have been the recipient, the victim of that discrimination and racism, have wanted that issue to be addressed? Or does it vary?
Yeah. So I'll address the first point, which is the impacts, right? How does this affect you long term? First and foremost, once someone experiences racism or discrimination in the workplace, their psychological safety within that organizational setting is hampered. So they no longer feel like they could be their authentic or true selves, or feel like the organization protects their well-being. And that has significant effects on your level of commitment within the organization. So whether or not you feel like you want to keep performing for this organization, keep being productive, it affects your level of engagement. And typically people become quite isolated as well within the workplace, which we know has long-term effects on their mental health and well-being. And ultimately, your career progression gets hampered as well, because you're not productive, you're not engaging within the workplace, you're not committed to the workplace, you've isolated yourself. So your opportunities to get promotions is hampered, or even want to actually go for a promotion gets hampered. Exactly. And I've seen it directly, even when I think about the case with my mum. Even though she would aim for another promotion, that felt no longer achievable to her, and something of which she had to question whether it is she wanted to do, because that organisation no longer felt safe to want to thrive and to excel. And coming on to your next point, which is like, how do people address it when they are in these work environments? If someone is experiencing racial discrimination, the first thing, and I talk about this with colleagues, with friends, you need to document what happened to you. So you need to write exactly what happened, where it happened, the time it happened, the date it happened, who witnessed it, and have a log of all the incidences that this has occurred. If there's any emails, you need to save those emails. And the reason I say this is because when you then go on to do an informal grievance, which is typically what a workplace would advise you to do, you need to be able to recount exactly what happened in a way that is indisputable to your employer, to your manager, to the witnesses, or whoever it is. Usually we'd hope for the best that our managers or HR professionals might do an effective job of addressing the issues. But typically, and what we've seen in the literature, is that usually that person who's made that complaint gets victimized. So they get penalized for making that complaint, or they are now seen as someone who they need to be cautious of because they are highlighting issues within the organization. And then after that, I guess people then typically would move to a formal grievance procedure, which unless you want me to go into detail, I can. But your formal grievance procedure is when you would make your written complaint to HR.
No, go into detail, because I'm sure there's going to be people listening already, in the midst of a HR grievance, and they're like, no, let me take some notes. Yeah.
Well, if you've done the informal complaint procedure, you've spoken to your manager, and for whatever reason you find that they haven't addressed the issue, maybe haven't confronted the person that's caused you harm, or they brushed it to the side, then I wouldn't advise anyone to keep pushing that manager or HR person, because they've effectively shown you the amount that they're willing to invest in this issue. You make a formal complaint, which is a written grievance. So that is when you might formally write in documented evidence all the issues. So where, when, what happened, who was there, to your typically HR manager or chief of people officer. It depends on the organization you're in and what happens. Once they've received that written grievance, the organization must respond. So they must respond with exactly what happened in regards to their investigation process. So did they speak to the employer that caused you harm, or the employee, I should say, that caused you harm? What was the outcome of that? When they did that, what happened, and what their approach is moving forward. If they cannot respond with those clear actions of what they've taken to address your grievance, then people might look towards the legal system, which is typically where you might do an ACAS conciliation or ACAS report, where they seek to do conciliation in the workplace. And I guess that's when you touch upon court cases and so forth. But if, for instance, you don't want to go down the line of a court case, because for a lot of people that is very intimidating, you have unions. Labour unions who you can consult with, who can give you advice that could do that mediation process for you. As I said, ACAS, or you can seek free professional legal advice from citizens advice that might help. But one thing I will stress, because we've all seen this a lot, is do not talk about this on social media. Do not mention this on social media. Do not write about it on social media. And the reason I say this is because if, for whatever reason, your complaint ends up going to that legal process, that can be used as evidence to suggest that you are not a credible witness. It can also be used against you in the courts if they find that whatever racial discrimination or whatever incident occurred was not considered as racial discrimination. The employer can then turn around and say, well, we are countersuing because you've hampered our name, you've put that in social media or in the public eye, and actually you could have breached confidentiality of what is occurring in the workplace. You also put your colleagues at risk as well, because if there was a witness that saw what happened, I think people forget that you can be victimized. So if you witness something and then are forced to testify about it or to make a complaint about it if you don't want to, you can also be penalized by a workplace based on that. And it's not legal, but we know it happens. So my advice would be follow the correct policies and procedures in your workplace. If nothing gets resolved, then you seek the more formal or legal or systemic approaches, which is ACAS, labour unions, and so forth. But do not put what happens, because this happens a lot, and people don't realise it's working against them.
Because people love a story time on social media. And I guess because my only feeling is perhaps they feel that it puts public pressure on the organisation that they're putting the complaint against. But obviously without the knowledge of what you've shared, they don't see the other side of it, how it can actually be detrimental to you. And, you know, a few things that I wanted to touch upon very quickly before we move on. Obviously you mentioned like there's like unions and other agencies. Like is there like an ombudsman type service for workplace complaints?
As in, so ACAS particularly focuses on organisations' workplace issues.
Okay, that's the main one.
That's
ACAS.
the main one, ACAS, and that's free as well.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend anytime someone goes through racial discrimination in the workplace and it's not resolved in their workplace, first and foremost contact ACAS, because not only will they give you free advice on the situation, how you should escalate it, but you can do a report highlighting all the issues that occurred and how it was not addressed by the workplace. And they will be the mediatory person between you and the organisation to then ask the organisation, can you respond and aim to reconcile?
Okay.
So their whole purpose is to find a way that both the employer and the employee can reconcile or to come to some sort of understanding. And of course, if your employer then doesn't do anything about it, then the reality is you probably exhausted all your options. The labour unions, as I said, are also good as well. And citizens advice, they offer a lot of free workplace-based advice as well.
No, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before, and you gave the example that sometimes you may put a complaint into like your line manager, but the scope of where they take it to and the extent to where they take it perhaps is not significant for you, like when you're putting in the complaint. Do you think that's a result of like line managers like not taking it seriously? Do you think it's not understanding racism and the impact of racism? Or do you think it's actually, I understand what you're going through, but then there's that deep-rooted unconscious bias and you know, you're making a big deal out of it, or they're trying to protect the company or whatever. Like what is it that makes a manager not understand when a staff member is coming and saying, this is what I've experienced, it's, you know, I'm a victim of racism. Like, what are you going to do about it to support me?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those things, but particularly the unconscious bias, them not actually understanding what racism is, especially in the modern workforce, where racism is more about microaggressions rather than overt incidences of racism. And for a lot of individuals in the workplace, microaggressions are still perceived as jokes, or things that are like informal, potentially banterous things we say to each other, not necessarily something that is deep rooted in discrimination, bias, and can affect your self-esteem, your belonging, and your mental health. And this is why I stress it's really important that when that incident occurs, you write down what the impact is. You write this down, and when you are communicating the issue to your manager, you also emphasize the impact as well. So they recognize that this is not something that you are highlighting as this was something I experienced today. It's something that you are highlighting has significantly impacted you as your person, your ability to show up as work, and your well-being. And in regards to them addressing it, I would always advise that you should actually mention to your manager how you would ideally like it to be addressed, as a blueprint or guidance for how they move forward. Because you're right, not every manager is well adept in supporting or helping individuals who experience racism, discrimination. Not everyone knows exactly how racism appears in the modern day workforce. So even though that is a significant amount of labour put on us, but the reality is that we will have to stress the impacts, and we'll have to stress, I don't feel, for instance, comfortable working with this employee. We need to explore how we move forward, especially if it's someone in the team, for instance. I need to explore how this moves forward because I do no longer feel like I can work in a team with this individual. We need to highlight effectively what would help you move forward.
Yeah. And you mentioned as well earlier that sometimes people who come forward, with these complaints, not only are they victimized, but they're penalized. Surely not.
So in the UK Equality Act, discrimination, it can be direct, it could be indirect, it could be institutional, but it can also be victimization. And I'm highlighting this because a lot of people don't necessarily realise that victimization is illegal. And it's the idea that when you even if you've witnessed someone who experienced racism or discrimination in the workplace, and you make a complaint about it, all of a sudden you no longer get opportunities at work. You no longer get offered promotions. You no longer get access, for instance, to those informal spaces that we were talking about. Or all of a sudden your manager is not showing you as much attention or care or consideration of your work. And some people might not necessarily understand why they're receiving that treatment, but if those actions directly led from you doing a complaint, either if you've experienced racism or discrimination or witnessed someone doing racism or discrimination, that is illegal and something that is quite predominant in our workplace, largely because, unfortunately, within the West, or particularly within Britain, we tend to protect the abuser, or we tend to protect the person who has created or perpetuated racism or discrimination, because it is so embedded within our institutions and systemically. It was, up until maybe 60, 70 years ago, the norm. And actually, up until today, in various different ways, the norm of society. And it touches on what you mentioned earlier about how managers don't necessarily see it as racism or discrimination if they make throwaway microaggressions or jokes. So the immediate or natural response would be to initially protect that individual who is effectively showing behaviours that align with years on and history of how normalised racism and discrimination is, rather than to protect the individual who is highlighting or flagging up the racist or abusive behaviour they're experiencing. So my answer to that question is yes, it is a real phenomenon in the UK and in America and in a lot of white majority countries. Yeah.
So for anyone, who's listening to this and saying, do you know what, like when I go to work, irrespective of, whether they work in healthcare, corporate, school, whatever it may be, and, especially in leadership, where they feel, what, I'm the only one, I'm the only black person, or I'm the only female. Like how, like what advice would you give them to sort of navigate, you know, those spaces, especially when they feel like they're the only one, because you go into that space already, you know, isolated. Like
Yeah.
how do they navigate those spaces?
Yeah, I'll give two recommendations. The first one is about creating spaces outside of your workplace. Um, this could be being a part of professional groups that are Black affiliated, or predominantly a Black group, where they talk and discuss these issues on a day-to-day basis, because this can make you feel as though your experience isn't your own experience. It is something that we experience as a collective, navigating the workplace. It can also give you access to resources. So thinking about when I did BIP Network, that was something we actively spoke about, how to navigate racism, how racism is embedded within the mental health and psychiatry and psychology system, and giving people the tools and strategies to be able to actually learn how they can apply it to the workplace. So be a part of a professional group. Some organizations even have affinity groups. A lot of them have affinity groups. Enter those spaces, be a part of them, listen, aim to acquire strategies and support from these individuals. They will help you to understand how you can navigate these issues within your own workplace and work setting. And I'd also, I guess this is a little bit controversial, but in the world of organizational psychology, it's quite a big phenomenon. And there's this phenomenon called person-environment fit. And effectively, this theory or this framework proposes that you need to be in an organization where it aligns with your values, your perspectives, your opinions, your thoughts, and so forth. If you are operating in an environment that doesn't allow you to be your authentic self, so you cannot show up to work as you are, talking about perhaps your own cultural ethos or your perspectives or your opinions, and you feel like you'll be penalized because it doesn't align with perhaps a dominant group in the workplace, you need to consider whether or not this is an organization that will realistically allow you to develop and to access opportunities long term. And in the corporate setting, this is a real big issue, because a lot of corporate environments like finance and law or consulting are very much aligned to the dominant group. And there are some companies that stay and prefer those traditional approaches, and there are ones that perhaps are startups that are more working towards a diverse and inclusive organization that will allow you to show up as your authentic self and appreciate the diversity that you bring. So I guess my second recommendation is not necessarily get up and leave your jobs, but actually reflect on the sort of organizational environment you want to be in, and whether or not an organizational environment where you cannot show up as yourself and you are constantly having to navigate a particularly white, westernized, Eurocentric environment that doesn't allow for people to show up as their diverse, unique selves, if that's something that is right for you long term.
That is, I've got some thoughts. I've got some thoughts, because really and truly, if that's the case, then there's no space for us, because there's, I don't feel like, if you can, like within healthcare, within education, within finance, like these spaces weren't made for us. So how do we then go into these spaces and expect those values and those areas that you've identified for us to sort of go in there and be our authentic selves, because we're already having to navigate environments and institutions that necessarily weren't made for us. But then as you were speaking, I was thinking about people who I've seen in the workplace who have come in and they've been their authentic selves. And I'm just been in awe of that. And I'm just like, this person don't give a, they're just, but then I'm also conscious of, and because I've had these discussions with like other colleagues in previous roles and current role, to say, yeah, they wouldn't make that person team leader. They're too boyish, or they're too outlandish, or they're too loud. but they're just being their authentic self. And I think like people can be their authentic selves within the workplace. And the workplace doesn't necessarily have to embrace that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna, they're going to get like the progression and the development that they might push for. But I think it's very, because as you were speaking, I'm thinking about my role, and there's certain aspects of what I do that I enjoy and I feel allows me to be my authentic self. But then there's certain aspects I feel like I can't be my authentic self, or I'm having to, shift or mold myself and try to adapt. And I don't feel like I can ever, I don't feel like there is a space where, as black men and women, we go in where we can
be our true authentic self.
Yeah, and we don't have to code switch and whatever else unless we're creating those spaces for ourselves. Like this is what I've built. But in terms of going into these institutions, that was my only thought.
Can I ask before I respond, as you said there was one part of you that felt you can be your authentic self, and then there was other parts of the role where you couldn't. What particular aspects of the roles, if you don't mind sharing, that was it that you felt I definitely cannot be my authentic self?
I guess for me it's in terms of like my personality and my character. It's like having to be stern, having to be disciplined. Because, if I'm stern, I'm disciplined, like the team will, Yannick's, a good leader, he's focused, he's too, like I'm not going to be like outlandish and, whatever else, because you don't want to be seen, not soft, but you don't want to show that vulnerability, like you want to be taken, seriously. So I think that's a side that not that many people like see to me. But it's something that I'm working on and I reflect on quite a bit. Then sometimes you get, oh no, wait, I'm your manager, I shouldn't be speaking for you for too long, you've actually got work to do, let me go off and do whatever. But I guess for everyone, it's different. But that's like one of the ones I can think of on the spot.
I asked just for context, because I think no matter where we go, especially in the UK, there are a set of professional norms that the UK or like Western society has established that no matter who we are, where we've come from, we are going to have to abide by. We are adapting or culturating to the cultural norms they've established in the workplace. But what I mean, and it's interesting you talked about the aspects of your personality that perhaps you feel that you potentially couldn't show in the workplace because perhaps it doesn't necessarily align with what is expected in the workplace. That is something that can apply to any environment you go in. So I'll use this example. So within academia rewards studiousness, it rewards introvertedness, it rewards being quite a structured individual and doing repetitive work tasks, but it doesn't necessarily reward someone who perhaps is more outgoing or someone that is quite, outspoken, or someone who prefers variety or flexibility in their work. Well, it is quite flexible. When I mean flexibility, I mean more of a varied work tasks. And I guess for someone who is a Black person, especially for someone like myself entering those spaces who doesn't necessarily thrive doing repetitive work tasks or being very structured. Academia was something I very quickly identified was not for me, because that is the typical norm of the organizational environment. Hence why I switched to more consulting based roles. But to make it more race specific, yes, because we as individuals have to abide by the cultural norms set within the professional setting, we also need to reflect on whether aspects of our personality, our authentic selves, is something that aligns with the organizational focus, values, and what they want from an individual. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to change the sector, but there can be another organization that appreciates authenticity or appreciates the way that you show up. And identifying those organizations is another story, especially in the state of the job market. But it is something that I think we need to reflect on when we enter an organization, whether or not they will accept you as an individual, walking into that space, being someone that can talk about your culture, can talk about your values, can talk about your perspectives and opinions, whilst not necessarily being shunned or oppressed or not valued for that unique person that you are showing up in that work environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does,
So it's not necessarily, yes, we have to abide by the Western standards of professionalism in the workplace. With each country you go to, it's going to change. I know in Dominica, which is where my family is from, a lot of the professional norms that exist in the UK do not exist there. But whether or not we feel like we can be our authentic selves in our organisation also relies on the extent to which our personality, our true selves can be shown.
Yeah.
And yeah, we need to reflect on the organisations we choose as well.
Yeah. No, that's that's powerful, man. And I don't think I've really ever sat down and considered that as a condition when I'm thinking about next steps, or when I'm thinking about, you know, like my career or employers or what jobs. I've never thought about that. You just look at the salary,
I have a job,
the location,
right? That's it.
the JD, I can do that, thereabouts. And then you get into the workplace and you hear so many people saying, you know, I hate it. I hate the workplace because it's not aligned with, you know, what like what your values are. And that's very telling because, and I've mentioned this before in my previous role when I was head of year at a secondary school, like prior to leaving, and obviously like the salary and me wanting, you know, like a better financial package and like more responsibility, like was a key reason for leaving. But when I look at the role that I went to do, that I moved onto, which was like more flexible, financially better, that the job was good as well. But it's the fact that when I proposed to the head teacher what I wanted at the time, like I was willing to work for less than what I moved on to, because like I enjoyed the role. But it's not something that I thought about practically. But I think moving forward, I think it's something that I need to bring up in conversations with like employers. Like, what is your value? Like, what do you guys value, and how is that aligned with my values? Is so important.
Ask them, how do you expect employees to show up at work? If they set a very strict guideline of rules, then you almost quickly identify that they are expecting you to be a certain person. They are not expecting you to show up as yourself and enact the roles and responsibilities that you will do at that job. So yeah, it's really important.
No, that's interesting. And I wanted to know as well, because earlier we were speaking about like those informal settings, and I know people be listening and say, you know what, yeah, that's me, but then we didn't really give us like guidelines to how they navigate that. So what advice, you know, would you give to people? And I wouldn't just say like newbies going into the professions, because even, you know, like there's a lot of oldies that think, oh, you know, I can't be asked. I've been doing this job for a certain amount of time. Let me just go home or whatever. Like how do people navigate, you know, being part of those informal settings? So you're not just there having a drink and being the awkward guy or the awkward girl on the corner.
Yeah. First, I'd say there are many ways to be a part of the informal the informal structures within the workplace. Most workplaces might have affinity groups, which I mentioned earlier, which is a space for you to be able to connect with like-minded individuals within your organization, and they might have out of work events, or they might do voluntary groups, or they might do interest-based groups, or they might do like wellness activities and days that you can be a part of. This is a safe starting point because at least you know you're walking into a group that already share similar values or maybe similar interests as you. It doesn't also just have to be affinity groups based on your marginalized characteristics. It can just be, for instance, they might have a run club as part of your work group. Join that because that might be an easy footing stone, an easy step you can take in joining those informal networks. When it goes beyond that, I would say seek mentors. Mentors are almost informal networks. I think we see them as formal networks because of the name mentor, but they are very informal. And mentors will be able to, for instance, tell you who you should talk to at work. For instance, if you're looking for a promotion and they are a leader, they'll be able to tell you, oh, talk to this person. He's here on this day or she's here on this day. They might tell you about outside events and activities that are occurring that they might be at, that leaders might be at, that you can integrate yourself in. So get a mentor. And when it comes to actually navigating these spaces, and I guess this is about the conversation of networking, I always say go with a curious mindset. Go in with the expectation that you are there to understand more about these people, understand what they do in work, outside of work, how they got to where they are. Do they enjoy their job? Do they not enjoy their job? Just go in with the expectation that you are just there to learn about these people. Because I think when we see networking or socializing with our colleagues, we still perceive it in like a formal way. We have to come with a set of questions. We have to still appear very professional and appropriate, which of course I'm not saying, you know, just say anything to them, still be professional, but we come to the conversation thinking that we have to appear in a certain way. If you approach the conversation as I'm just here to understand who I'm talking to and understand how I can learn more about my work or excel more in my workplace, the need to have to present yourself in a certain way reduces. And people love talking about themselves, really and truly. So just asking and shooting questions at them is the easiest way to build a quick bond with someone and a relationship, because they'll see you as trustworthy and someone that they can integrate within their own circles at work or outside of work as well. So that would be my advice.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. And I think it's advice that I need to take on as well. I wanted to ask, and I'm not sure if this is a real term, or maybe I've just coined it in my head. Racial fatigue.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It might be a real term, but
Maybe I've not heard of that one, but maybe.
So, but I'm gonna give the context as to which it's, you know, sort of come into my mind. But before I go into that, just to give some context, I remember this was just after COVID, and I haven't had many direct like racist acts towards me or acts of discrimination towards me. Like I'm 35 years old and I can count maybe in one hand when that's happened. Because I'm knowing me, I would have dealt with that interaction. So I say that to say I recall during COVID I was at the school that I was working at as a head of year, and it was in like southwest Southwest London. But anyway, someone from one of the buildings, like I was going into the car park, threw a banana skin down, like in
Oh
my
gosh,
direction. And I looked up and I thought, there's no bins.
Can't be me.
Like, oh, is this what we're doing? And I was like, yo, that experience was like just crazy, uncomfortable. And maybe like a couple of days or maybe like a max a week, like I was battling whether to like tell my head teacher about it. And I think it was in the midst of everything that had happened with like, you know, George Floyd, etc. So there was just like a lot of uneasiness. And I remember speaking to the head teacher about it, and he's cool. Like we've got, you know, got a good relationship. And he was like, oh, like is it?
That was it.
And I was like, oh, okay. And then I'm thinking about that experience, and I'm thinking about experiences that I've had post that where colleagues have said to me or spoken to me about experiences that they've experienced within the workplace where they have been like racially discriminated. And I say, oh, why don't you raise it? Because for me, I'm like, you can't just have this experience and live in that experience. Like you need to raise it with someone. I spoke to whoever about something similar in the past, like no one did nothing. And why I mentioned that racial fatigue, and maybe just fatigue was the word that I'm looking for. When people have been in those situations where they're like, this has happened before, nothing gets done, and they're tired, and they just don't say anything. What's the impact of just not saying anything because you're tired and you just want to get on with your job and, you know, go home and feed your family or do whatever? Like, what's the impact of not saying anything?
Yeah. I think first and foremost, I'm so sorry to hear that happened to you. And it's even just hearing that, it's triggering. And I think it's interesting you use the term racial fatigue, because I felt fatigued hearing that story, as in this is what we as Black people experience on a day-to-day basis. And I'm tired of hearing these stories, and I'm tired of, as well as you, probably having to learn and figure out how do we navigate this all the time. And I think when it comes to the impact, it really is drawing back on what Carter said. It is PTSD that eventually occurs. The idea that we become traumatized, and with that traumatization, we become hyper-paranoid. We become really hyper-vigilant, and eventually depressed, because we are operating in an environment where we either expect to experience racism or we are experiencing racism. So that fatigue, it is really and truly just depression, anxiety, paranoia, hypervigilance, burnout as well. So burnout is a term coined to explain the emotional fatigue and exhaustion we get from repeatedly experiencing stress. So if we are repeatedly experiencing stress related to racism, we become burnout. We become exhausted with our environments and cynical, because that's an aspect of burnout. So the long-term effects of that is dire for our mental health, our well-being, and often not discussed is our physical health as well. Hypertension, diabetes, and also musculoskeletal issues. I'm an org psych, so we always talk about the impact of sitting at our desk all the time or being tense. And we don't necessarily realize that has issues with our body functioning. And the reason I mention that is when we are extensively stressed, we tend to tense up. So our shoulders will be like this. You might frown all the time. You don't even realize it. Then we start to get the neck, the back pains. Our hips are not mobile. We get knee pains. So the impact of continuously witnessing or experiencing racism is detrimental to our physical, our mental health. and our overall motivation, really, when it comes to if we have to bring it back to the workplace, wanting to operate and stay in these spaces. And this is why intervention is so important. Within the Black community, and I'm sure you've probably spoken about this in your podcast, we are quite hesitant to engage with psychiatric or psychological therapy. However, speaking to a therapist who will help you to understand and process your trauma can not only help you learn coping mechanisms, but also ways that you can positively move on or continue to operate within life. So some of the coping mechanisms can range from just fixing or I guess becoming more physically active. But one that I always like to talk about is actually engaging in activism work yourself. It's not for everyone. I'm a testimony to this. When I saw racism occurring to my mother and the impact it had on her, it prompted me to want to start the BIP network because I felt that this inability to be able to directly address the racism and the impacts it's having on my mum, I can use that to empower other individuals to be aware of how racism and discrimination impacts us and how we can bind together as a community to continue to explore how we can address it as a collective. So activism work can be really helpful to use that anger, to use that exhaustion and actually see or help and support other people in the community. It makes what happened to us feel meaningful. Not meaningful in a way that, oh, I've experienced racism, that must mean something. Meaningful in a sense of I'm using that experience to empower and support other people and help my community. So yeah, that was a long-winded answer to your question, but I wanted to end on the importance of seeking help. When we are continuously to experience this racial fatigue, as you coined the term.
No, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. And just to finish off, I wanted to know, like, from your experience and your perspective, what are some of the things that like organizations and employers can do to really address this issue, apart from, you know, the anti-racist training and anti-racist policies and whatever else? To be honest, I don't even know if they're effective. I guess research will need to be done on that as well. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I could sit here all day talking about that. But I actually did my PhD research included the effectiveness of diversity training as one of the core studies. And a long answer cut short, it's not effective. A lot of research shows that there's no long-term effectiveness, and any short-term effectiveness is not something that could be relied upon, because the reality is people are going into these spaces, they will never come out and say that, oh, I hated that was awful, or I don't believe in D&I. They will always praise it positively because people are fearful of the backlash of not being supportive with DEI initiatives. So something that I always advise organizations or professionals that are doing DEI work to start with is a root cause analysis, which is a fancy way of saying you need to investigate where the organization currently is with their DEI. So you need to understand what employees or leaders think about DEI. Do they have proactive attitudes to it? Are they positive about it? Do they want to implement it? You have to investigate the level of harassment and discrimination that occurs within the organization. Is it significant, or is it minor? Or even the processes and procedures to actually make a harassment and discrimination case. You need to investigate the level of diversity you have in the organization. And then only when you get, and there's many other things, but only when you capture where the organization is currently at with their DEI or the multicultural nature of their organization, then you can start to consider how to address it. And the reason I mention this is because there is this approach within DEI whereby a company might say, okay, we've had an employees or quite a few employees complain about racism. What do? Let's put in anti-racism training, or let's just, talk to the managers. They don't ever investigate what is causing that. is it a case of there is a culture whereby they are letting, as we spoke about earlier, their culture is actually pro-westernized kind of historical attitudes about race? That's why it keeps occurring. Are leaders not doing the investigation process? You need to understand. And anyway, because I don't want to go on for too long about it, but once you've done that investigative work, then you can think about the sorts of interventions that are required. But I will say that no intervention alone will work. You usually have to implement multiple organizational interventions. So it could be things as obviously the training, you can include mentorship, you can think about your hiring strategies, you can think about the sort of affinity groups that are present. Do you have staff dedicated for DEI? You think about it holistically. And then once you've implemented those strategies, you have to keep evaluating their effectiveness, because usually an organization will implement, let's say, diversity training. They won't evaluate, and then they just say the job's done. We've done what we've needed to do. You need to keep evaluating to see if there's actually a change. And then if there is a change, then we keep implementing those initiatives, or we reassess. It is the exact same approach that anytime if there is, for instance, a health and safety issue in the workplace, or there is an issue with, I guess, let's say technological transformation, right? Embedding AI. We do these really extensive evaluation projects on how we can implement it, what we need to change, but for some reason, we don't do this with DEI. And I think it's because organizations just want a quick fix to the issue. We need to take a really systemic organizational change approach. So I guess long answer cut short. Organizations need to completely evaluate their culture, their leadership, and their policies and practices before implementing any solution. And then if they do implement solutions based on that, they need to be multifaceted and comprehensive, and then they need to keep evaluating the effectiveness to see if there's actually change.
No, that's amazing. That's amazing. Dr. Keisha York. do people call you Doc?
Yeah.
Doc. This has been so insightful, so eye-opening. You've given me a lot of, food for thought just in terms of my general practice, and I know already that there's going to be so many people who are listening and will be able to resonate with the experiences, that we've shared. But then I also know that there's going to be people who may not resonate with the experiences that we've shared because they're not from our background, but it will challenge them. It will get them to, reflect, because essentially, this platform and these discussions is about, educating, but education, for all. So thank you. I appreciate you coming on the episode.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And it's been such a good discussion as well.
Great stuff. So that has been the Too Cool for School podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channels and follow us on all of our social media platforms.